I was an assemblyman and then a state senator, and I chaired the Assembly Transportation Committee. Subsequently, before I left the Assembly, I chaired the Assembly Ways and Means Committee, and then in the Senate, I chaired the Senate Transportation Committee.
So tell me about the formation of MTC.
Okay, well, it goes back to my early election to the Assembly, which occurred in 1962. And prior to that time, I was a practicing attorney. I was actually a deputy attorney general for the state of California. And then I ran for office. I had been also appointed to the Bay Area Transportation Study Commission, which did a report upon transportation and regionalism in the Bay Area. And being a member of that commission, I was sort of an enthusiastic supporter of regionalism and regional transportation in particular, although I also supported the concept that then Assemblyman John Knox had with respect to multi-purpose regional systems or authorities. And unfortunately, from that point of view, John Knox's bill failed on the Assembly floor, and I went to John Knox and indicated that I wanted to pursue the concept, limiting it to transportation, which I did, and that was how it was passed. Now, initially, when I put together the proposed regional transportation institution, I introduced a bill called the MTA Act, Metropolitan Transportation Authority, and that bill failed, I believe, in the Ways and Means Committee, and I think it failed because it was just had too much authority coming from the top and not enough from the local or regional entities. So I proceeded, after that session ended, I proceeded to hold hearings in the entire Bay Area. I held them in San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, Napa, Solano, all of the counties that now constitute the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And I asked them to tell me what their ideas were as to how the commission should be formed. And we held the hearings. We listened to their information, and I then went back and put the bill together. I think it was SB Arabi 363, and it had the 9 counties and about 100 cities, somewhere in that neighborhood, that made up the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And again, we were trying to work from the bottom up rather than enforce rules from the top down. And that gained the support of the various counties, cities, and we eventually put it together. Not that it was easy, it wasn't. It was very difficult, and there were many organizations, such as the AC Transit, Golden Gate Bridge, that wanted to be members of the commission. And I resisted that basically because I thought it was supposed to be a neutral type of entity that made decisions fairly among all of the various applicants for state and federal funds. And so I was successful in resisting that. I was successful also in resisting an effort to make the members of the commission elected. And the reason I opposed that was because I thought it would be better if we had governmental entities of the composite members actually who had authority to deal with the issues on their own jurisdictions. And that is why the commission is established the way it is, as far as voting members are concerned. The non-voting members were basically federal and state non-voting participants. And that is basically how it was formed. But I was always a strong supporter, active supporter for regionalism in the Bay Area. The San Francisco Bay Area has multiple counties, unlike Southern California. And to deal with issues, certainly as an issue like transportation, but also issues like air pollution, water, and all of the other areas, it needs a unified approach, and it certainly doesn't need different entities lobbying Washington or the state to try to take care of their particular entity, even though that's laudable from their point of view. It's a problem when you're trying to integrate a whole regional system within the Bay Area of San Francisco. We explored the idea of having ABAG take on that responsibility, but there were significant problems of going that route, one of which is the sheer size of ABAG's membership. I didn't think they would be able to get anything done. Also, ABAG had a number of other areas of concern that they would have to address. I was afraid it wouldn't be focused sufficiently on the transportation problems that we faced. You have to remember that when I created this, transportation policy in California was totally, for all practical purposes, freeway and highway oriented. In fact, Article 19 of the California Constitution says that all state fuel taxes have to be dedicated to streets, roads, and highways. And that had been on the books for many, many years. And it served us quite well during the immediate post-World War II era when we built the freeway system, which is serving us still today, although getting more and more congested. So the issue was basically to try to deal with the problems on a more focused basis rather than the huge membership of ABAG and the huge responsibilities of ABAG.
So paint me a picture of what the transportation landscape looked like back in 1962. I mean, how long did it take to get across the bridge? Explain to our audience that actually at the time at the Bay Bridge, you could choose to go on either the top or the bottom. For people who haven't been around here a long time, what was it like?
Well, you go back to the situation, it took far less time to get across the bridge. But all of the reports indicated that the bridge was going to be more choked and more congested in the future, and it needed a relief. So there was a report done basically by Caltrans to create a southern crossing of San Francisco Bay, and it would have been south of where the current bridge is, and it would be anchored on one side in the Alameda area, and on the other side around Freeway 380. And that report indicated that the bridge was going to have more traffic than it was engineered for. I don't quite recall the exact number of vehicle trips per day that were crossing the bridge at that time, but it was getting beyond its capacity for which it was engineered, and something should be done. At that time, there was legislation proposed in the California state legislatures, the Assembly in particular, to literally stop the southern crossing. I opposed that legislation on the Assembly floor, but it was supported by a very prominent member, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee at that time, and he was pushing for that, and I was defeated in my efforts to stop this particular piece of legislation, and as a result, the southern crossing was eliminated. And unfortunately, it was needed, and anyone with any vision would see that the congestion that we have today would have come upon us. And ironically, we had all of the money. I think $200 to $250 million would have built the Southern Crossing at that time. And we had the right-of-way. And we had the anchorages on either side. And there was, in those days, at that time, there was no environmental report required. So it was all set to go. All it had to do was start the building. But that was stopped, and now we have the huge congestion that we have today. And had we built it, you wouldn't have that kind of congestion. You would still have congestion, but it would be nowhere near what it is today. And that's unfortunate, but that's what happened.
So take me through sort of the cycles of transportation here in the Bay Area. All right, so then you start with the idea of MTC, and you gave me sort of a read of the landscape in that traffic was still moving pretty well, but the prediction was is that it was going to get much worse. So then what's the next evolution in that cycle?
Well, the next evolution in the cycle, at least from one point of view, the Bay Area succeeded in passing the BART system. That was passed, the bond issue was passed in 1962, and the actual building of it didn't open until about 1972. And that was to address the fact or the reality that you couldn't just build freeway after freeway after freeway. There wasn't enough land, there wasn't enough money, there wasn't enough, and the demographics of the Bay Area was such that you couldn't, you had a bay to cross and a lot of water. So how do you deal with this? Well, the way you deal with this, as far as I was concerned, was multi-purpose transportation policy, which I supported and pushed very significantly. Prior to that time, the senator from Wairika was chairman of the Senate Transportation Committee, and he was very, very strong in favor of freeways. And that's understandable. He was from a rural county, and his concept was to build freeways and freeways and more freeways. I, coming from a Bay Area urban environment, had a different point of view. I said, we will continue to have a freeway program, but we have to interact it with public transportation, transit. And so I pushed for the transportation system, the BART system, and other transportation systems as well. And eventually was able to support legislation that would provide for some of the money to go from into transit as well as highways, and that legislation is on the books today. I also pushed for, carried several bills that allowed for the overflow of sales tax on gas to be used for transit transportation purposes. And that was sort of to address the issue of how you provided a transportation policy that was not exclusively for freeways, but also combined what I thought was necessary, transit as well as freeways.
I had spoken to Congressman Lantos before his passing, and you know, one of the defeats he just quite couldn't get over was the fact that he couldn't persuade everybody to understand the importance of BART circumnavigating the bay from the very beginning. Any comments on that?
As you know, the original plan had 5 counties, the 3 counties, San Francisco, Alameda, and Contra Costa, that are presently members of BART, but it also had Marin County and San Mateo County, and it went down to Santa Clara County. The difficulty was with respect to the Marin County, it was an engineering problem to some extent. There were other problems, and that is trying to get across that very high cliff that goes up to from Marin side to the San Francisco Bay side. That was a problem from that point of view. But in San Mateo County, which was necessary to be a member of the BART operation in order to get to Santa Clara County, the members of the Board of Supervisors of Marin County stopped the vote on that. So BART was never successful in getting to to Santa Clara. Now, ironically, it was San Mateo County that came up with a significant amount of the funding that puts BART into San Mateo County. San Mateo County had to buy in at a far greater cost than they could have bought in had they stayed in the original 4-county or 5-county system. And that's basically what the issue was on that.
What made you a believer in regionalism so early on? I mean, looking back in the early part of your career up in Sacramento, you know, San Francisco was clearly the preeminent dominant city in the region. San Jose still had a bunch of orchards. Oakland wasn't even, I mean, was just like, you know, just there on the other side of the Bay Bridge. How did you see or predict that regionalism would become as important as it has today?
Well, I thought regionalism was not only important to the other counties that you mentioned, but it was also important to San Francisco. San Francisco lives on commuters, and you can't have an economy, a viable economy in San Francisco, without the interaction of the other counties in the vicinity. And it is true that San Francisco was the preeminent county at that time, but it was obvious also that the population was growing in Alameda County, Contra Costa County, Santa Clara County, San Mateo County, and even to a lesser extent in Marin County. And you had to move people, and you have to move goods. And the more people you can get off the highway and into transit, the more you can move other people and goods through the existing system. So I saw this as a basic benefit to San Francisco and pursued it accordingly. And as I say, my experience on the Bay Area Transportation Study Commission confirmed that direction.
So now that BART is sort of in the works, what's the next cycle of transportation in the region?
Well, I think you have to continue pursuing transit-oriented types of solutions. As I said, the ability to pave any more in the Bay Area is extremely limited, given the water barriers and others, and mountains. And I think we have to pursue that to a greater extent. That means expanding BART, eventually connecting to Santa Clara County. That there are a number of proposals to do that. However, the costs are astronomical compared to what they would have been had we done it originally. And so the main objective, I think, is to consider transportation as a major aspect of the future of regionalism in the Bay Area.
Talk a little bit about when you look back at the 40 years of MTC's history, what are some of the big accomplishments that stand out in your mind?
Well, MTC became a model nationally for the allocation of federal and state funds because it was efficient, it avoided duplication, it avoided significant rivalries among various transit and other types of agencies. It adopted a program of trying to solve regional problems among the various constituent members of the commission and of the counties. And I think that pattern became the model for the federal government to insist that there be an MPO or an MTC of some type before they would even consider granting funds. And MTC is able to prioritize with the cooperation and the willingness of the constituent members, so that you don't have this crazy quilt kind of transportation system in the Bay Area. And I think that is the most significant achievement of MTC. And I think they can be very proud of having succeeded in doing so.
You're almost the father of MTC. How do you, because you can't quite birth it, so I can't call you the mother. How do you, what other are there tangible accomplishments of MTC that you think should be mentioned?
Well, I think that the overall plan for the Bay Area, MTC comes up with their annual and then 5-year plan, and they have literally coordinated the various projects and proposals, put price tags on them, and determined how much they would cost and where the money was going to come from, so that you don't have one county or city pursuing one solution and another one pursuing another, all in competition with each other. And I think that is one of the most important aspects of MTC in the last 40 years, and also the allocation of funding on a prioritized basis, because each city or county has its own priorities, but those priorities cannot ignore the priorities of the other cities and counties within the commission. And you have to have a cooperation, or you have total chaos, or as I said, a crazy quilt adoption of a transportation system.
Now, you probably had the vision to foresee this, but just for the people who are watching this video, you know, MTC started with its major role being all things transportation, and yet over the years you've seen it grow into where some of the major issues facing it are things that involve housing or land use planning, that sort of thing. Explain that evolution and how it's a natural flow from the agency's origins.
Okay, well, you have to start with what I mentioned earlier, and that is that the effort to put together a multi-purpose regional system failed in the legislature. And that's when I cooperated with then Assemblyman John Knox to develop a system that at least focused on transportation, which I told John Knox I thought I could get passed, and did. And but that didn't mean that the need for the multi-purpose type of system didn't cease to exist. As a matter of fact, it became more and more important as issues became more difficult to resolve. Air quality, pollution doesn't stop at the borders of Alameda or Contra Costa or San Francisco. Water is not an issue that can be solved by one county and one county only. So these issues have to be addressed on a multi-purpose basis. So I think it's a natural evolution for MTC to move in this direction. And they are moving in this direction. They have meetings with BART, they may have meetings with the Bay Area Council, they have meetings with the Air Pollution Control District, And all of these systems are becoming, that people are beginning to realize that you have to move in the multi-purpose type of system. And that's where BART is going, and it seems to me and it's appropriate. So it has evolved from a single focused institution to one that is bringing in other areas of concern to the people and need to be resolved.
Describe to me the different roles that MTC has versus what ABAG is doing in terms of regionalism.
Well, MTC has a limited purpose, for one thing, and ABAG has a much larger purpose. And it is very difficult, it's more difficult, I think, to get resolution of some of the issues that ABAG faces with such a large and diverse membership. And I think that I support ABAG, and I think it does a good job, but it has difficulties in resolving some of the very difficult issues that it faces. And so I think what is happening, the evolution, as you call it, with the cooperation that's occurring with MTC, BART, ABAG, and other air quality pollution district, all of that cooperation, I think, is important, and it's a good direction for it to go in.
Any other accomplishments in MTC's 40-year history that you want to bring up?
Well, I think I've been pretty general, and it would be difficult for me to go into specific issues. Certainly, one of MTC's major accomplishments, obviously, was the involvement in the retrofitting and rebuilding of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. And that is underway now, and we presumably can look for that being completed in 2013. And the MTC was very, very much involved in the legislation and in the expanding the tolls so that the project could be paid for, and that's a very, very important accomplishment of MTC. As people moved further and further away from the urban areas or the employment centers, they had to buy homes far more distant from those points, industry and cities. And in doing so, the commute became more and more difficult and longer and congested. And I think what you have to look at is how do you address the needs of the people who want to get to those centers. And I am very strong in favor of using transit. And also the new concept of trying to locate housing units in the vicinity of transit stations so that you don't have to keep going further and further out, buying up farmland and changing it from suburban to bedroom communities. And I think that in the Bay Area, there's a limited amount of land that you can transfer in that way. So the idea of bringing the people in closer to transit stations and operations makes sense not only from a regional planning point of view, but it makes sense to the people who want to get to their destination efficiently, quickly, and with a limited amount of time being spent in doing so. So I think people are coming to the conclusion that they don't want to live in Fairfield if they have a job in San Francisco. They want to live someplace closer to San Francisco and closer to a BART station or a Muni station or whatever the case may be that allows them to to commute. When I'm in my car and caught in traffic, obviously I feel a great deal of frustration, and I say to myself, why can't it be otherwise? I'll give you an example of how it affects me personally. For many years, my wife and I have subscribed to Berkeley Rep. Now, we live in San Francisco, and Berkeley Rep is very short distance from San Francisco. However, when we were meeting people for dinner, we were setting up for dinner at 6 o'clock on the East Bay, and we would normally leave our house at 5, and then that wouldn't get us there by 6. Then we left at 4:30, and sometimes even 4:15, and we would still miss the 6 o'clock dinner appointment that we had with our friends. So we literally ended our subscription to Berkeley Rep. And then a few years ago, we decided, well, let's try BART, and that's what we do today. As a matter of fact, tonight we are going to Berkeley Rep, and we're taking BART.
What do you think about MTC's current efforts to get people out of their cars and into transit, or the promotion of bicycling and walking?
Well, I think it's a very admirable objective, and I think that it should be pursued. But there's only a limited amount of changes you can make to encourage that. Again, I think trying to develop housing near transit stations is probably even a better way to go, because I think you'll attract more customers than you will on bicycles or pedestrians. Remember that elderly people use transit quite a bit, and they can't, as a practical matter, use bicycles, and in many cases can't walk that far or those distances. Or if they're handicapped, they can't get around as well as they should, and so they have to rely upon the transit system. And I think MTC supporting and promoting that concept, which they do, they have a policy for promoting that, is very admirable.
So, if you could set the agenda for MTC in the future, what do you think are the most important issues that it should tackle?
Well, the ones that I just mentioned, promoting and encouraging housing development near transit stations, the filling in of urban areas so that transit can be used more effectively, encouraging people to get out of their cars and onto transit. All of those ideas that MTC is currently pursuing, I think they should continue to do so. And I think that's very important to the entire viability of the Bay Area. And I think the affordable housing that is being promoted by ABAG and other cities and counties should continue to be pursued, because that is the equity issue, as I understand it now, is how do you service through transit and others people of lower incomes. And the way the system works now is the wealthy live in enclaves that are sort of removed from the rest of society, and we have to do what we can to encourage the integration of communities so that they can take advantage of the system. And I think affordable housing is an important aspect of that.
You've birthed MTC. You see where it is today. Your thoughts on its evolution?
I think its evolution is to continue to grow and to pursue the policies that it has, with a very good transportation plan that is updated regularly so that it can always be address the needs of the communities that it encompasses. But I think that the other direction, where they are working in cooperation with other major regional institutions such as ABAG, such as the Air Quality Control District, such as water quality, all of those issues are affected by transportation in many areas, in many respects, and they should continue to pursue those objectives, because regionalism is necessary to the viability of the Bay Area.
Given the benefit of hindsight, if you could rewrite sort of the ground rules for the formation of MTC all over again, would you change anything?
No, I don't think I would. You have to remember that it was a very, very difficult bill to get passed, and it required the consent and cooperation of 9 counties and almost 100 cities, and that is very difficult to achieve. I don't know what we could have done that would have made it capable of being passed if we had not put the provisions in that we did. Now, I know that there are problems which would be such as Santa Clara, the tremendous growth of Santa Clara County, the very high growth of Alameda County, and the question as to whether or not they have appropriate proportional representation. And maybe that would be something not only that I would address, but I probably would have had to address in order to adopt the MTC legislation.
What would you like to say on the occasion of ABAG's 50th and MTC's 40th anniversaries?
I would like to say that they've both done a very good job. Certainly MTC has lived up to all of the expectations that I had of it, and I think it has achieved its objective of coordinating planning in the Bay Area, coordinating and priorities, and coordinating funding for the major transportation projects in the area. ABAG has far greater responsibilities, and they too have done a very good job, I believe, in trying to bring a regional approach to the problems of the San Francisco Bay Area.
Tell me your thoughts when you found out that the MTC Legislative Award would be named the John Foran Legislative Award.
I was surprised, actually. I hadn't expected it at all, but they did it quite a few years ago, and I was very, very flattered.
My last question was, which I thought of, is, and tell me if you feel comfortable answering this question, with AB 32 and then the follow-up of SB 375, what are your thoughts about this kind of legislation to really put some incentivized teeth into some of the policies that that are going to promote regionalism?
Well, I think AB 32 is a very responsible piece of legislation. It has difficulty in trying to be implemented because of the various opposition groups. But in the long run, we have to, I believe, address climate change, and this, of course, is a very, very strong measure in that direction. One of the problems, of course, is that it is confined to one state, and the problem is of national interest, and I don't know if one state can take the burden on by itself to solve a national problem.
But then when you look at SB 375 and the way it doesn't penalize you for not doing it,
Right.
But it incentivizes you to do that. What's your feel about that sort of encouragement?
I think incentives are better than penalties. They bring about more cooperation and I think a success in obtaining the objective.
And so do you think the nation is going to be watching to see how that works here?
I think the nation will very definitely be watching how it works here. And the question is whether or not it will succeed here is still up in the air. But it's certainly a national problem, and it should be addressed nationally. Unfortunately, the economy of the United States is in bad shape, and it's very difficult to address issues of this magnitude under the existing economy.
Do you have any predictions as to its success in the somewhat near future?
I don't know. I think that the Congress in particular has to become more responsible and less partisan in addressing national issues. I think the partisanship that exists in Washington and in Sacramento has really destroyed the ability to solve problems. When I was elected to the legislature, I believe we were problem solvers, and the legislature did not have deficits. We dealt with issues responsibly, made sure that whatever we voted for was paid for, and on a sustaining basis. I think now with term limits, legislators think that they can adopt programs, vote for programs, and then let somebody else that follows them into the office worry about how to pay for them. And I think that's unfortunate, but it seems to be a fact of political life. Larry Doms was a very good executive director. And a story I can tell you about that is when I was chairing the Assembly Transportation Committee, the Legislative Analyst's Office, which is where Larry Doms was located at that time, had very little to do with transportation because Senator Collier had no use for the Analyst's Office and transportation policy. So when I became chairman of Assembly Transportation, I literally took over almost all of his time in developing not only MTC, but the Golden Gate Bridge and a variety of others. And so I used the Legislative Analyst's Office consistently to the extent I think I used up all of Larry Dom's time in the Analyst's Office on transportation. Then he had to get some more additional help. So when MTC was created, I certainly recommended Larry Doms as Chief Executive Officer.
No, he thought that was wonderful training.
Yes.